Greetings, friends of liberty. When we survey the malignant reign of the Sunflower King, number 14 of that vainglorious and pompous succession of French sovereigns, who sucked virtually every last remnant of sustenance from the marrow of the French people, we unsurprisingly see that this third member of the House of Bourbon retained to the end his ability to shock and dismay with the gargantuan extent of his venality and arrogance. Take the issue of land and land rights. In England, we understand above all that a man's home is his castle. Louis, on the other, thought that the entire compass of France was his playground, that if he desired any piece of it, he had the right of it. And not only in France, no. So, for example, in North America, the French explorer René Robert Cavelier claimed the whole of the Mississippi Valley for Louis, naming it Louisiana. No doubt if Louis had encountered a hunting party of the native Choctaw, he would have demanded their obeisance on bended knee, after first demanding they remove their feather. And not only American land did he regard as his own, but also European. In order to conquer and mad the lands of other European sovereigns, he taxed his subjects mercilessly, impoverishing them all. For the War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the War of Reunions, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, if I were of a mind to coin a phrase to describe such overweening moral and political presumption, I would say, just as we call a man who believes in a republic a republican, so too we might call Louis, who believed he had the right to the totality of everything in France and elsewhere, a totalitarian. Do I not surpass myself? Unfortunately, when I proudly mentioned my newly coined word to Marguerite, she raised her eyebrows and merely shook her head. No doubt at what she regarded as my own surfeit of presumption. I can see I will have to show her again in our own playground, even more thoroughly, who is the master. Now, if we turn to the issue of totalitarians, whether of the past or those found in your own 20th century in Europe, we see today Stanley Payne's focus on one branch of totalitarians, the fascists, in his comprehensive A History of Fascism, 1914 to 1945, a book superb in both its depth and breadth of coverage. Payne examines every significant worldwide fascist movement and leader during this period, granting his reader the opportunity to acquire a superb political and historical understanding. He begins by outlining a central problem of the study of fascism. While numerous authors, on the one hand, will give their own varied definitions of it, another set of authors, numbering in the many hundreds, forswear making any attempt at all, they representing the gut instinct approach. So while Payne himself proceeds by briefly considering various definitions outlined by political philosophers, in the end he offers us his own. Fascism may be defined as a form of revolutionary ultra-nationalism for a national rebirth that is structured on extreme elitism, mass mobilization, and the Führerprinzip, positively values violence as an end as well as means, and tends to normalize war and/or the military virtues. This definition points to both the intensity and thoroughness of fascism's desire to violate rights. So as he says, it is, number one, revolutionary, not parliamentary. Number two, ultra-nationalistic, so the ultra form of nationalism, which is rights violating anyway. Three, believes in the Führer principle, so one man telling everyone else what to do, ignoring their rights. Number four, normalizes war, of course. And number 5, military virtues in the service of violence and aggression. Turning to the ideological, he then gives us a brief history of pre-fascist thought in Europe, starting with Sorel, who in 1908 emphasized the moral character of violence, its importance in generating a sense of seriousness, commitment, purpose, solidarity, and common bonding. Payne believes that this was the first clear theoretical statement of status doctrine. Then there was also the father of modern discriminatory racism in Europe, the French aristocrat Arthur de Gobineau, and of course, the Germanized Englishman Eustace Chamberlain, whose foundations of the 19th century codified the new Germanistic doctrines of mystical racism, combining social Darwinism with racism and thus an endless racial struggle on behalf of the purity of Aryanism and against Jews. Payne makes a distinction that the economist Ludwig von Mises made as well, distinguishing defensive patriotism, common to almost all times and places, from nationalism. He also apparently distinguishes between nationality, simply a feeling of belonging to a nation, and nationalism, which I regard as aggressive. So, for example, he says, whereas classic English nationality was individualistic and civic, emphasizing constitutionality and civic rights, the nationalism that developed in late 18th century France was more collectivist in character, stressing central unity and collective purposes. Whether the Germans, whom Payne focuses on the most, took a special path to modernity, called a Sonderweg, is often debated. Payne argues that their romanticism fused with their nationalism created what is called Völkisch culture, one translation being folk culture. Payne claims that Germany, as it developed, was similar to other European countries, but at the same time notes their unique coercive or statist view of economics, which developed from the 1840s on. This was nationalist in my sense, in justifying rights violations in economics. Also notable was the growth of anti-Semitism. By the early 1890s, 3 small anti-Semitic National Socialist parties had been formed: the Anti-Semitic German Social Party, the Anti-Semitic People's Party, and the Peasant League in Hesse. After dealing with Germany, he continues his European tour, mentioning A. Austria, which, although its liberalism was weaker and it was anti-Semitic, didn't end up fascist as Germany did. B. Italy, which was filled with those opposed to bourgeois culture, liberalism, humanitarianism, and pacifism, who specifically said, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world, and militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for women. We want to demolish museums and libraries." Italy's resulting wars included those in Libya and Ethiopia. C. In Turkey, Payne argues that World War I, as it did elsewhere, played a destructive and exacerbating role. A war that had been produced in part by extremist nationalism had the effect of greatly exacerbating that same nationalism, resulting, of course, in the Armenian genocide, the first great genocide of the 20th century. In the Balkans, Bulgarian extremists proposed the employment of mobile gas chambers, a sort of precocious anticipation of both the Nazi final solution and later Balkan ethnic cleansing. Having completed his ideological survey of Europe, Payne then gets to the meat and potatoes, chronicling the beginnings of the first actual fascist party and regime, started, of course, in Italy by Mussolini. Payne says that Mussolini was deeply influenced by the theoretical critique of Marxism. For the young Mussolini, revolution required violent action and leadership by elites, meaning the masses could only be moved by sentiments, emotions, and myths. Although the fascists had been largely socialist in the beginning, by 1919, their political program resulted in significant electoral defeat. So, for example, in industrial Milan, the center of the fasci, they drew only 5,000 of 275,000 votes and elected no one. And thus, mid-1920 was the high watermark of the socialist offensive. The problem for the fascists was that Italy actually was not a country ripe for revolution, with social reforms in 1911 and 21 already having given over to 1 million Italian peasants farmland, after which they became more conservative. By 1920, black-shirted fasci squadristi began to launch assaults on socialists in the countryside, for here they could count on newfound support among virtually all sectors of the middle and upper classes, and even among some laborers. The homicide rate for Italy jumped from 8.62 in 1919 to 13.95 in 1920 and reached a maximum of 16.88 in 1922. Mussolini had at first supported the socialist occupation of the factories, but he soon declared war on the socialist organizations. By the first months of 1921, the fasci completely changed character, social structure, ideology, and many original members fell by the wayside, and a number even passed over to the opposite side. In late 1921, the fascists held a conference forming their official political party, the Partito Nazionale Fascista, the PNF. Economically, the party wanted to reduce state expenditures, improve the tax structure, eliminate most state subsidies, guarantee free trade, and encourage capital formation, as well as support the 8-hour day and progressive social legislation. Party membership then was over 200,000, with over 75% in the north. During 1922, the fascists took over police stations, community centers, and even arsenals in north and south central Italy. However, despite Mussolini becoming the semi-constitutional leader, the basic legal administrative apparatus of the Italian government remained intact. There was no fascist revolution, save at the top. Down to 1940, there were only 9 political executions, mostly of Slovenian terrorists. And with regard to the Catholic Church, as early as 1922, the Vatican indicated it would not oppose the Mussolini government and appreciated fascism's role in the defeat of the left. Incidentally, it was the many newly formed countries and democracies like Germany, Italy, and those in the Balkans, like Romania and Yugoslavia, that were vulnerable to fascism. None of them were established countries and or democracies of Europe who had long-standing democracies turned fascist. As Payne says, countries with stable party systems, such as Britain, France, and the Low Countries, were largely immune. Fascism in particular, and totalitarianism in general, was a symptom and consequence of political backwardness, which is why also Russia and China turned communist. Having now covered Italy, let's turn to Germany. Payne argues here that nothing specific in Germany's political or social nature caused the German catastrophe, but instead the interplay of destructive ultra-nationalist tendencies with a unique chain of crises and traumas which afflicted German society in the 2 decades between 1914 and 1933. Among these were the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation in 1923, and the Great Depression. Payne concludes by saying, though National Socialism was not merely the product of this succession of unprecedented traumas, it would have been impossible without them. He describes, in addition, the succession of German anti-Semitic parties and organizations, the proliferation of authoritarian and fascist groups, such as the Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmets, the main German veterans organization, how the German left became increasingly powerful, thus polarizing and motivating those on the right to become more violent, how Hitler and the Nazi Party toned down their more extreme rhetoric to gain more and more electoral support, and in the end, how Hitler outmaneuvered all those politicians who, underestimating him, thought they could control him. Payne argues that the victory of so extreme a movement as National Socialism in a country with so high a level of education, technology, and culture as Germany was absolutely without parallel. In differentiating German fascism, Payne seems to argue that National Socialism, in fact, constituted a unique and radical kind of modern revolutionism. Quoting another theorist, he argues that it possessed, among others, 1. A supreme new leadership cult of the Führer as the artist genius, 2. The effort to develop a new social Darwinist structure of government and society, and 6. The goal of a completely new kind of racial imperialism on a world scale. In comparison to Italian fascism, he says, number 1, that the Hitlerian ideology was founded on mystical Nordic racism, something not merely unknown to Italian fascists, but for which Italians in general could not qualify. And number 2, in 1934, Hitler became the unchallenged chief of state and complete dictator, a position never held by Mussolini. And reversing it, how did Mussolini and the Italian fascists differ from Hitler and the Germans? A. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini had no specific grand design in foreign policy other than to increase Italy's prestige and build a larger empire. And B. The almost complete absence of anti-Semitism in Italian society, partly because Jews were well integrated and even at times part of the fascist party. Even extremist, ultra-fascists wrote that Nazism, with its parochial and exclusivist racism, was offensive to the conscience of mankind and would push Europe into communism. Now let's turn to and consider other European countries. Number 1, Spain developed its own authoritarian nationalist and fascist parties and dictatorship, but Payne argues that while Franco would likely become fascist if Hitler had won, he didn't cross the fascist line. Partly this was because of the strength of Spain's traditional Catholicism, combined with the remnants of its 19th century classical liberalism. The most prominent fascist party, the Council of the Nationalist Syndicalist Offensive, failed to have the slightest impact on Spanish affairs and garnered less than 1% of the vote in 1936. Number 2, while Portugal had one of the oldest traditions of liberal constitutional government in continental Europe, its historic liberalism had been elitist and oligarchic, restrictive, and never democratic. It was the 4th country in which a successful military coup seized power in 1926. This was a rightist authoritarian regime established by the military in 1926, so not fascist. Number 3, Hungary found itself partly under the spell of the Arrow Cross movement, who, with their nationalism and anti-Semitism, briefly formed a puppet government under the Nazis in 1944. The leader of Arrow Cross, Ferenc Szalasi, proclaimed himself not anti-Semitic but asemitic. Jews simply had no place in such a society. They would not be persecuted but would be required to emigrate. Number 4, Romania. Romania formed the 3rd non-puppet, authentic fascist government in 1940, partly under the leadership of the General Eminescu in combination with the Legion of Archangel Michael movement, which fused Christianity with ultra-nationalism. This too was highly anti-Semitic. Its original leader, Codreanu, had believed that violence and murder were absolutely necessary for the redemption of the nation, a principal effect being a unique death cult, unusually morbid even for a fascist movement. Number 5, France. France, for its part, had a wide variety of fascist movements and organizations. Payne says there are general consensus about the remarkably high level of French fascist literature and thought. Belgium and Holland, too, had their own. Number 6, turning to Asia, and specifically Japan. Japan had a long history of racism and imperialism and created, during the fascist era, small radical nationalist circles and radical elements of the military. The principal influence from abroad was that of Nazi Germany. This was a more religiously tinged movement than usually occurred in Europe, since, according to Shintoism, they believed the emperor to be divine. Japan, too, like so many countries that turned to fascism or communism, was backward democratically, only beginning to expand the electorate slightly in the 1920s. Number 7 now, Latin America. How many countries here could qualify? Not Chile, since although it formed the National Socialist Movement in 1932, its leader specifically criticized Hitler in 1937. Not Mexico, with its synarchistas, who were more on the left and not violent at all. However, Argentina came close under its Axis sympathetic dictatorships before and during World War II, and afterwards with the dictatorship of Perón until 1955, was quasi-fascist, but still didn't get complete one-party control and allowed more pluralism than found in Europe. Also, Perón, using his wife Evita, Don't Cry for Me Argentina, as a power intensifier, was unusual. In Bolivia, however, its National Revolutionary Movement, the MRN, probably for a time was fascist. However, after World War II, it gave up its fascistic cabinet members and program. Again, note how if one fascist regime fails, then other countries will turn away. But if it succeeds, they turn towards it. Number 8, in the Middle East, there are lots of regimes that were fascist or come close, such as Nasser in Egypt, especially with its anti-Semitism. However, since Islam is so strong, these regimes are often imbued with a religious flavor that European fascism usually didn't have. Then again, the secular regimes of Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Gaddafi's Libya were essentially Middle Eastern fascism. In his concluding sections, let's select just a few of the many choice morsels that Payne leaves us with. A. He notes that while communist regimes were as violent as fascist, ideologically they usually proclaimed peace as a goal, unlike the fascists who glorified war. As Payne says, no such equivocation characterized Adolf Hitler. Not merely did Nazism preach war and violence as a necessary form of activity to bring out the intrinsic qualities of the master race, but Hitler held specific goals that required major war as soon as possible. B. Payne notes that unlike in World War I, when the German army shot 48, the least amount of its men as deserters among all the major powers in World War II, it shot between 13,000 and 15,000 German soldiers who were executed by their own army, equivalent to the loss of nearly 2 divisions at a rate equaled only by Stalin's Red Army. C. Can anyone tell me which were the 5 neutral countries on the continent during World War II? 3 S's. Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal, and Turkey. D. Which Nazi-conquered countries were treated the best? Denmark, Norway, and Holland. E. Regarding the Italians. Given that they were never had much desire to fight for Hitler, they had a saying, which roughly translated went, "If England wins, we will lose, but if Germany wins, we are lost." Payne notes that Italy's war performance was worse under the fascists than it was in World War I under a liberal regime. He also notes again how very many Jews the Italians and the Italian army protected. The ultimate survival rate of the Jews in Italy, 83%, was exceeded only in Denmark, where most Jews were simply smuggled out of the country to safety early on. F. And what was Vichy France? A regime of moderate right authoritarianism that identified with Franco and Salazar in Portugal, rather than with Hitler and Mussolini. But its Jewish policy was much more destructive than that of Italian fascism. After the war, vigilante groups delivering summary justice or injustice killed from 7,000 to as many as 40,000 fascists. In conclusion, this is a book that is so good in so many ways that I'd give it an A+. First, although 600 pages, every paragraph is grounded in the national and historical reality of the period or situation being discussed, so it's the exact opposite of dry, academic, or unnecessarily abstract or theoretical. Secondly, it ambitiously covers worldwide fascism, so you're getting huge breadth, but at the same time enormous depth. The upshot is that if you learn what's in this one book, you'll be able to talk intelligently with anyone about the history and nature of fascism from just one book. Very happy for my part with my own countrymen that we English have demonstrated time and again an intrinsic dislike and hostility to tyrants, whether absolute monarchs or fascist totalitarians, and a willingness and even eagerness to fight them whenever and wherever they appear. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.